This is the account of Neve Torin, as recorded by Thyra, warden of the Varanthi Reaches, and entered into the proceedings of the Caldera Council on the day the non-viable classification protocol was suspended after 600 years of unbroken use. I tell it here because the council asked how a stable hand accomplished what 3 of our surgeons could not, and because the answer is not what any of them expected, and because some truths only land properly when you hear them from the beginning. They brought the dragon to her stable on a Thursday, which Neve remembers because Thursdays were when the grain wagons came through Kelder's gate, and she was standing in the yard counting sacks when the military transport pulled up, and 2 soldiers in accord livery climbed out looking like men who had drawn the short straw and knew it. "Neve Torin," the taller one said. "That's me." He handed her a scroll with a wax seal she did not recognize. "Requisition order. Your stable has been designated as a temporary holding facility for a surplus draconic asset pending final disposition." She looked past him at the transport. The rear gate was down, and inside, chained to 3 separate anchor points with the kind of redundancy that suggested either extreme caution or extreme contempt, was a dragon. She was not large. That was the first thing Neve noticed. The war dragons she had seen in formation over the valley were the size of grain barns, their wingspans casting shadows that made the livestock bolt. This one was perhaps twice the size of her largest draft horse, her body hunched in the transport's bed with her neck curved, and her head tucked against her chest in a posture Neve recognized from years of working with injured animals. The dragon was making herself small. She was trying to disappear. Her scales were the color of fog, a pale, washed-out silver that caught no light and threw none back, as if the pigment had been diluted until there was almost nothing left. An albino, or close to it. Her eyes, when she raised her head at the sound of voices, were the palest pink Neve had ever seen on a living creature, and they tracked the soldier's movements with the flat, resigned attention of something that had learned to expect pain from uniforms. "What happened to her wing?" Neve asked, because even from 20 feet away she could see it. The left wing was folded wrong, the joint swollen to twice normal size, the membrane hanging limp and gray where it should have caught the morning light and shown the vein structure beneath. The wing was not broken. It was worse than broken. It had healed wrong. The joint fused at an angle that made full extension impossible, and someone had tried to correct it. She could see the surgical scars, 3 of them, layered one over another like failed drafts of a letter, and each correction had made it worse. The soldier shrugged. Born defective. 3 surgical attempts, 3 failures. The 16th wing tried to train her as a ground runner, but she wouldn't take commands. Bit a handler. Then the veterinary board at Caldera Central classified her as non-viable and scheduled her for disposition. But the paperwork got tangled because she's technically still on the Imperial Breeding Registry as a Varanthaline albino, and nobody wants to sign off on destroying registered stock. So, he gestured at the stable. "Temporary holding." "How temporary?" "Until someone with enough rank decides she's worth more dead than alive, or until she dies on her own. Either way, not our problem after today." He held out a clipboard. "Sign here." Neve signed. They unchained her. The dragon came down the transport ramp with the careful, 3-legged gait of a creature that had learned to keep its weight off the bad side, her claws clicking on the metal, her damaged wing dragging behind her like a sail with no wind. She did not look at the soldiers. She did not look at Neve. She looked at the ground, and she walked into the stable as if she had been walking into stables her whole life, which I suppose she had. Her name, according to the paperwork, was Registry Asset 4471 V. Neve called her Vale. The first week was observation. Neve knew dragons the way she knew horses and cattle, through years of physical proximity, through the language of muscle tension and ear position, and the particular way a frightened animal holds its breath. Vale was not like a horse. Horses telegraph everything. Vale was still. She sat in the largest stall, the one Neve had cleared of hay bales and fitted with a sand floor because she had read somewhere that dragons preferred mineral bedding, and she watched with those pale pink eyes and gave nothing away. Neve brought food, standard military rations, compressed protein blocks that smelled like old leather and tasted, she imagined, about the same. Vale ate them. She did not eat them eagerly. She ate them the way a prisoner eats, because the alternative is worse. On the second day, Neve noticed that Vale had not moved from the spot where she had first settled. The sand beneath her was compressed to the shape of her body, a depression that held her the way a mold holds a casting, and she had not left it even to relieve herself. She had simply not eaten enough to need to. The military rations were calibrated for a ground-running dragon at combat weight, not a damaged albino half their size, and Neve realized that the blocks were too large and too dense for Vale's jaw, which showed its own subtle asymmetry when she chewed, as if the muscles on the left side did not fire with the same strength as the right. On the third day, Neve replaced the protein blocks with fresh-killed rabbit. She had trapped it that morning, dressed it behind the tack shed, and brought it still warm. Vale looked at the rabbit. She looked at Neve. Something shifted in her expression, not gratitude, not yet, but a flicker of confusion, as if kindness were a language she had once known and had forgotten the grammar of. She ate the rabbit in 3 bites and licked the blood from her claws with a precision that reminded Neve of a cat washing its face. And for the first time since her arrival, her tail moved, a slow, almost imperceptible curl around her own haunch, the draconic equivalent of a breath released. "There you go," Neve said, and went back to her work. I should tell you who Neve Torin was, because it matters. She was 53 years old. She had run the Torin family stable for 31 of those years, since her father's back gave out and her mother's hands followed, and in that time she had gentled 17 horses that other handlers had given up on, nursed a wardrake back from colic that the military vets said was terminal, and once, during the Sarathi border raids, kept 11 civilian mounts alive through a 6-week siege by feeding them boiled bark and prayer. She was not a dragon expert. She was not a veterinarian. She was a stable hand with strong hands and a patient disposition, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had spent her entire life being told that some things could not be fixed, and had found, more often than not, that the people saying it simply had not tried hard enough. She had buried her mother 6 years before Vale arrived, her father the year after that. She lived alone in the farmhouse above the stable, and she ran the business alone, and she ate her meals alone at a table built for 4, and the loneliness had settled into her the way cold settles into stone, not sharp, not urgent, just present, a fact of the architecture. She did not complain about it. Complaining about loneliness felt like complaining about weather. You adapted or you didn't. Vale's wing was the challenge. Neve could see what had gone wrong. The joint had been allowed to heal in a contracted position after what she suspected was a birth defect, and the surgical attempts had focused on breaking and resetting the bone, which was the wrong approach entirely. The problem was not the bone. The problem was the connective tissue around the joint, which had shortened and calcified during the initial healing, creating a mechanical lock that no amount of resetting would release. You could break the bone 100 times and it would still fuse wrong, because the tissue around it was holding it in place like a vise. She knew this because she had seen the same thing in horses. A foal born with a contracted tendon will walk wrong its whole life if you focus on the bone and ignore the soft tissue. The fix is slow, tedious, and unglamorous. Daily stretching, warm compresses, incremental extension over weeks and months, the kind of patient, repetitive work that no surgeon wants to do because it does not look like surgery, and it does not feel like healing, and it requires you to show up every single day and do the same thing, and trust that the body knows what it is doing even when it does not look like progress. She started on day 5. The first session was bad. Vale did not understand what was happening, and when Neve placed her hands on the wing joint, slowly, with her voice low and steady, the way she would approach a mare with a foaling injury, Vale flinched so hard that her whole body shifted sideways and the stall wall cracked. The surgical scars were tender. The tissue beneath them was inflamed. She was in pain, and the last people who had touched her wing had caused more pain, and she had no reason to believe this woman would be different. Neve did not force it. She removed her hands, sat down in the straw beside Vale and waited 20 minutes, 30, an hour. Vale watched her the way prey watches a predator that has not yet committed to the chase, alert, still, her breathing shallow and controlled. Neve did not move. She did not speak. She sat and she let the dragon decide. At the end of the hour, Vale lowered her head to the sand and closed her eyes. Not sleep. The tension in her body was still wire-taut, but a concession. A test. She was giving Neve access to her vulnerability and waiting to see what would be done with it. Neve stood up very slowly and left the stall. The next morning she came back with warm compresses, soaked linen wraps heated over the stable's wood stove, the same one she used on horses with strained tendons. She entered the stall. She sat down. She waited. After 40 minutes, Vale lowered her head again. This time, Neve reached out and placed the first compress against the swollen joint. Vale trembled. Not a flinch, a tremor that ran through her body from nose to tail tip, a vibration Neve could feel through the floor. The compress was warm, not hot, and Neve held it there with both hands, steady pressure, and hummed under her breath the way she did when foals were frightened. She did not have a good voice. The humming was not music. It was vibration, low and constant, and she had learned long ago that animals respond to consistency more than beauty. After 5 minutes, the trembling stopped. After 10, the wing relaxed, a fraction of an inch, barely visible, but Neve felt it under her hands. The joint gave just slightly, the tissue softening in response to the heat and the pressure and the absence of anything sharp or sudden. "Good girl," Neve said. Vale's tail curled. That was how it went. Every morning before the sun cleared the eastern ridge and the day's work began, Neve spent an hour with Vale. Compress, pressure, slow extension, never more than Vale could bear, never faster than her body allowed. Some days the joint gave nothing. Some days it gave a millimeter. Neve measured progress in millimeters, and she marked each one on a chart she kept on the tack room wall. And on bad days, days when the joints swelled up and they lost ground, she looked at the chart and reminded herself that the line, overall, was going in the right direction. The soldiers came back once after 3 weeks to check on the asset. They stood in the stable doorway and looked at Vale sitting in her stall with a warm compress on her wing and a half-eaten rabbit at her feet, and Neve kneeling beside her with straw in her hair and linen wraps over her shoulder, and one of them said, "She's still alive. She's still alive. Any improvement?" Neve pointed to the chart. They did not look at it. "The disposition order is still pending," the taller one said. "Could come through any week, just so you know." "I know." They left. Vale watched them go. Then she turned her head and looked at Neve, and for the first time, Neve saw something in those pale pink eyes that was not resignation or fear or the flat watchfulness of a creature expecting the worst. It was a question, a simple one, asked without words, the way animals ask the questions that matter most. "Are you staying?" "I'm staying," Neve said. The setback came in week 4, and it nearly ended everything. The joint had been progressing, 41 millimeters of recovered extension, almost 2 inches. Neve was optimistic. That was the mistake. Optimism made her push. Not much, an extra degree of extension, held for an extra 30 seconds. The kind of push that would have been fine on a horse. But Vale was not a horse, and the calcified tissue around the wing joint had a threshold Neve had not mapped, and when she pressed past it the tissue tore. Not badly, a micro-tear, the kind that heals in days, but the inflammation that followed was severe. The joint swelled to 3 times its normal size overnight, hot to the touch, and when Neve came into the stall at dawn, Vale was pressed against the far wall with her damaged wing tucked beneath her body and her eyes on Neve, with an expression that cut worse than any wound Neve had ever treated. Betrayal. Vale had trusted her. She had let Neve touch the thing that hurt most, and Neve had made it worse, and in Vale's eyes she was no different from the surgeons. Another set of hands that promised help and delivered pain. Neve did not touch Vale that day, or the next, or the day after that. She brought fresh rabbit. She changed the bedding. She sat in the stall and hummed and waited and did not reach, and every day the question in Vale's eyes was the same question, but harder now, edged with something that looked like grief. Are you the same as the others? Meanwhile, the stable's regular work did not stop. Horses still needed shoeing. Feed orders still needed filling. The neighbors' mounts still came in for boarding. Neve ran it all on 4 hours of sleep, spending every spare minute in Vale's stall doing the only thing she could, being present, being patient, being the one who did not leave even when the leaving would have been easier. She lost weight that week. Her neighbor Kellen noticed and brought her a pot of stew, which she ate standing in the tack room because the chair was covered with compressed supplies, and she could not remember the last time she had cleared it. It took 9 days. 9 days of sitting in straw, of patient silence, of being present without reaching, before Vale lowered her head again and offered Neve her wing. And when she did, Neve placed the compress with hands that shook, not from effort, but from the weight of what Vale was giving her, which was a second chance, offered by a creature who had run out of reasons to give them. The tear healed, the swelling receded. And Neve learned something that changed how she worked, not just with Vale but with every dragon who came after. The body knows its own limits better than any hand that touches it. Her job was not to push. Her job was to follow. After that, she never led the stretching. Vale led it. Neve held the compress, provided the warmth, created the conditions, and Vale decided how far, how fast, how much. Some mornings she gave nothing, and Neve accepted it. Some mornings she gave 3 millimeters in a single session, and Neve marked it on the chart and said, "Good girl," and they were both content with what the day had yielded. The first sign that Vale was beginning to trust the world beyond Neve came in week 5. Neve was grooming one of the border horses in the adjacent stall, a nervous bay mare named Copper who spooked at loud noises and had once kicked a farrier through a wall. Through the stall partition, Neve heard a sound she had never heard from Vale before, a low, sustained hum barely audible, a vibration more felt than heard. Copper's ears came forward. The mare's breathing slowed. The tension in her hindquarters, the coiled readiness to bolt that never fully left her, eased for the first time since Neve had known her. Vale was calming the horse, not with intention perhaps, not with the deliberate resonant speech that military dragons were trained in, but with something instinctive, something that lived in the deep architecture of what dragons were, a warmth, a steadiness. The same quality that Kellen's cows had responded to, that the goats leaned toward, that the barn cat sought when she curled against the base of Vale's stall at night. Vale was not just a dragon who could not fly. She was a dragon whose purpose had not yet found its shape. It was 6 weeks in when Vale first extended her wing on her own. Neve came into the stall with the morning compress and found Vale standing, not sitting in her usual position. She was on her feet, her 3 good limbs braced wide, her neck extended, her head turned to look at her own left wing. And the wing was moving, not much, a twitch, a flutter. The kind of movement you might miss if you were not watching for it. The way you might miss the first green shoot in a field of ash if you were not down on your knees with your face in the dirt looking for exactly that. Neve stopped in the doorway. Vale's wing twitched again. The joint flexed 2-3 degrees no more, and the membrane caught the light from the stable window, and for one instant Neve could see through it, see the vein structure, the delicate architecture of flight, and it was not gray and dead. It was flushed, pink, alive with blood flow that had been blocked for months, maybe years, and was now finding its way back through tissue that had finally, grudgingly, decided to let it pass. Vale looked at Neve. "Do that again," Neve whispered. She did. The extension was small, perhaps 5 degrees total, a fraction of what a healthy wing could do. But she was doing it herself. She was choosing to move a part of her body that she had been told, by 3 surgical teams and a veterinary board and an entire military apparatus, was beyond repair. She was choosing to try. Neve sat down in the straw and pressed her face against her knees and wept in a way she had not wept since her mother died, which was 6 years ago, and which she had thought she was finished with. She was not crying because she was sad. She was crying because something that had been hurt so badly it had given up was choosing not to give up anymore, and the relief of witnessing that is a kind of grief turned inside out, the same weight, the same heaviness, but the direction is different. It falls upward. Vale crossed the stall and lowered her head and pressed her muzzle against Neve's shoulder. Her breath was warm and smelled of copper and rabbit and something mineral, something deep earth, something that had no name in any language the woman knew. Her scales were smooth against Neve's skin, not cold the way she had expected, but warm, the way sun-heated stone is warm, holding the heat long after the source has moved on. "Good girl," Neve said into Vale's neck. "Good, brave girl." After that, the progress accelerated. The body has a way of compounding its own healing once the initial resistance breaks. Neve had seen it in horses, the way a tendon that resists stretching for weeks will suddenly begin to give, each session building on the last, the gains doubling and then tripling as the tissue remembers its original shape. Vale's wing followed the same pattern. 5 degrees became 10. 10 became 20. By week 8, she could extend the wing to half its natural span, and the membrane was filling in. New growth, thin and translucent but strong. The kind of growth that happens when the body decides to invest in a structure it had previously abandoned. Neve built a pen in the paddock behind the stable, a fenced area large enough for Vale to move freely, and on clear mornings she opened the stall door and let the dragon walk out into the sunlight and practice. Vale was clumsy at first. The muscles that controlled the wing had atrophied during the months of disuse, and the coordination required for even partial extension was something she had to relearn from scratch. She would extend the wing, hold it, lose control, and the wing would collapse back against her body with a sound like a sail luffing in a dead wind. She would stand there, breathing hard, her tail rigid with frustration, and then she would try again. She always tried again. Neve's neighbor Kellen came by one afternoon to collect his bay mare, who had been boarded for shoeing. He stood at the paddock fence and watched Vale practice and said nothing for a long time, which was unusual for Kellen, who generally had an opinion about everything and shared it whether you asked or not. "She's different," he said finally. "She's healing." Not just her. He nodded toward his own pastures visible beyond the tree line. "My cattle have been calmer since she got here, the yearlings especially. They usually bolt at the grain wagons, but the last 2 weeks they just stand there, and my milk yield is up." He looked at Neve with an expression she could not quite read. "What is she doing?" Neve had noticed it too. The horses in the stable were easier. Copper, the nervous bay who had once kicked a farrier through a wall, now stood for grooming without twitching. The barn cat, who had spent 3 years hiding in the rafters, slept openly on the hay bales. Even the valley itself seemed to have shifted, the morning fog lifting earlier, the frost line retreating, as if Vale's presence had introduced a warmth into the local atmosphere that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the low, sustained hum that she produced, almost inaudible, a vibration that traveled through stone and soil and the bones of living things and said, without words, "I am here, and here is safe." "I don't know," Neve said, "but I think it matters." On one of those mornings, something happened that Neve did not expect. Vale extended her wing to what Neve estimated was 60%, the farthest she had ever managed, and held it. The membrane caught the morning sun and threw light across the paddock in a wash of pale silver, and the wind lifted the membrane slightly, just enough to create resistance, and Vale's whole body shifted, her claws digging into the earth, her weight redistributing as instinct took over from effort. For 3 seconds, the wing was not a damaged appendage. It was a surface designed for air. And the look on Vale's face, the expression in those pale pink eyes, was not pain or frustration or the flat endurance Neve had come to know. It was wonder. Pure, startled, ancient wonder, as if she had just remembered what she was built for. The wing collapsed, Vale stumbled. The moment passed, but Neve saw it, and Vale knew she saw it, and something changed between them that was not about the wing at all. It was about being seen in the fullness of what you could become, not just what you had been reduced to. Neve did not know they were being watched. The first sign was a shadow. She was in the paddock on a bright morning, sitting on the fence rail while Vale practiced extension drills. Neve had tied a length of cloth to the wing tip and was using it as a visual marker, the way you use a flag to gauge wind, and she noticed the shadow pass over the yard. Not a cloud. Clouds do not move that fast, and clouds do not circle. She looked up. High above the valley, almost at the edge of visibility, something was flying. It was too far away to identify, but it was large, and it was watching, and it was doing the slow, deliberate circles that Neve recognized from her years working with raptors as a surveillance pattern. It came back the next day, and the next. By the fourth day she could see it more clearly, deep bronze scales catching the sun, a wingspan that dwarfed the grain barns, the slow, powerful wing strokes of a dragon that had been flying for centuries and had long since stopped needing to think about it. Vale saw it too. She would stop her exercises and tilt her head upward and watch the bronze-shaped circle, and something would pass across her face, not fear, not recognition, but something older and quieter, something like longing. "Do you know who that is?" Neve asked. Vale did not answer. Dragons could speak. Neve knew that from the military briefings, the resonant speech that traveled through stone and bone, but Vale had not spoken since her arrival. Neve had assumed she was mute, or that the military training had conditioned the speech out of her. She was beginning to suspect a third possibility, that Vale had simply decided there was no one worth speaking to. I descended on a Tuesday. No warning. No military transport, no requisition order, no soldiers with clipboards. Just the sound, the low, percussive beat that I know humans feel in their chests before they hear it with their ears. The wing beats of something massive displacing air with the authority of a creature that has never needed permission to go anywhere. Neve came out of the tack room and stopped. I landed in the front paddock, all 50 feet of me, my scales the deep bronze of old cathedral bells with the patina of verdigris and gold that comes from millennia of wind and sun. Behind me, my attendants, Sailor and Korath, Sapphire and Burnished Copper, settled into formation on either side. The yard was suddenly full of dragons, and Neve was standing in the middle of it in her work boots and her stained linen shirt with straw in her hair and a warm compress over her shoulder. My eyes found her, and I saw what I expected to see, a small, weathered human woman with calloused hands and no title and no rank and no understanding of what she had done. I also saw what I had not expected, no fear. "You are the one who tends her," I said. It was not a question. "Yes," Neve said. My gaze moved past her to the stable, where Vale was standing in the doorway of her stall, her body half hidden behind the frame, her pale eyes fixed on me with an expression I had not seen on a dragon's face in a very long time. It was recognition. It was terror. It was hope so fragile that looking at it felt like holding a soap bubble, one wrong breath and it would cease to exist. She knew what I was. She knew what I represented, the system that had condemned her, the authority that had signed her death. And she was hoping, against every reason she had been given, that this time might be different. I should explain what I am, because it shapes what I was prepared to see and what I was not. I am Thyra, warden of the Varanthi Reaches, custodian of the Northern Territories, keeper of the census of wings. I am 1,412 years old. I have overseen the classification of 937 dragons under the non-viable protocol, and I have signed the disposition orders for 604 of them. That is a fact I carry. I do not offer it as a confession or an apology. I offer it because you need to understand that when I landed in that paddock and saw what Neve Torren had done, I was not a neutral observer. I was the system. I was the authority that had condemned Vale and every dragon like her, and the compresses and the patience and the fresh rabbit were an indictment of everything I had administered for the better part of a millennium. And yet, her wing, I said, show me. Neve walked to Vale's stall. The dragon was trembling, that full-body tremor, but layered now with something that was not fear alone. Neve placed her hand on Vale's neck, on the smooth, fog-colored scales, and I watched the trembling lessen at the touch. I watched a condemned dragon lean into a stable hand's palm the way a child leans into a mother's arms, and something in my chest, in the deep place where the dragon fire burns, shifted. "It's all right," Neve said. "Show her." Vale looked at Neve. Those pale pink eyes held a question that was also a plea. "Is it safe?" "It's safe," Neve said. "I'm here." Vale stepped out of the stall. She walked into the paddock, into the sunlight, and I watched every step with an attention that cost me nothing because attention is the least a witness can offer. Vale stopped in the center of the yard. She braced her legs. She turned her head to look at her left wing, the wing with the 3 surgical scars and the faded calcification marks and the new pink membrane growing in where the gray had been. And she extended it. Not halfway, not the careful, controlled, partial extension she had been practicing for weeks. Full extension. The wing opened like a flower remembering spring, joint by joint, membrane stretching taut between the finger bones, the veins flushing pink and alive in the morning light. It was not perfect. The joint still hitched at the 40-degree mark, and the membrane was thinner on the left side where the scar tissue ran deepest. But it was open. It was whole. It caught the sunlight and held it, and for one moment, standing in that paddock in the dirt and the straw, Vale looked like what she was, not a surplus asset, not a disposition case, not registry number 4471V, but a dragon. I lowered my head. I have bowed in military formations. I have bowed in the diplomatic ceremonies of the Accord. Those bows are choreographed, institutional, empty of everything except procedure. This was not that. I lowered my head until my chin touched the grass of Neve Torren's paddock, and I held it there, because I had just watched a wing that my own veterinary board had declared dead open in the sunlight, and the creature who had saved it was a woman with a warm cloth. The Varanthe Veterinary Board condemned this wing 18 months ago, I said, keeping my resonance low and careful. 3 of our finest surgeons attempted reconstruction. All 3 failed. The consensus was unanimous. The wing could not be saved. The dragon could not fly. She was classified as non-viable and scheduled for destruction. I paused. "You are a stable hand." "Yes." "With no surgical training, no veterinary credentials, no draconic anatomy certification." "No." "What did you use?" "Warm compresses. Slow stretching, fresh rabbit instead of protein blocks, and time." I was silent for a long moment. My attendants on either side had not moved since the landing, but their eyes were tracking the conversation with the sharp attention of creatures who understood that they were witnessing something that would need to be remembered accurately, because it would be told again and again, and it needed to be told right. "Matriarch Thessaly of the 7th Caldera will want to speak with you," I said. "She's welcome to visit. The stable is open." "You do not understand. When the matriarch wants to speak with someone, she does not visit. She summons." Neve looked at me, 50 feet of ancient power with a wingspan that could shadow a village, and she looked at Vale, standing in the sunlight with her wing open for the first time in her life, and she looked at the compress still draped over her shoulder, and she said the thing that was true. "She can summon if she wants, but I have work to do here, and Vale's exercises are at dawn, and if the matriarch arrives before sunrise, she'll have to wait in the paddock like everyone else." Vale made a sound. Small, quiet, not quite a laugh, the draconic equivalent of a breath caught halfway between amusement and something warmer. It was the first sound she had made since her arrival, and it hung in the air between us like the first note of a song none of us knew the words to yet. "I will convey your terms," I said. And then, with a formality that felt right, older than the military, older than the accord, older than whatever institutional apparatus had classified Vale as non-viable, I dipped my head again and said, "The Varanthi remember those who tend what others discard." The matriarch came on a Friday, not at dawn, mid-morning, which Neve appreciated because it meant Thessaly had listened. Thessaly was smaller than me, which surprised Neve, and older, which did not. Her scales were a deep, weathered slate gray, the ridges worn smooth by centuries of wind and sun, and the particular erosion that time inflicts on things that endure. Her eyes were gold, and they held the same layered depth as mine, but with something additional, a weariness that was not fatigue but experience, the particular tiredness of someone who has seen the same mistakes made over and over, and has stopped being angry about it, and started being patient instead. She came with an entourage, 6 dragons, all wearing the formal shoulder marks of the Caldera Council, their scales polished to a ceremonial sheen. But the matriarch herself wore nothing. No markings, no insignia, no indication of rank beyond the way every other dragon in the paddock oriented toward her the way compass needles orient toward north. She looked at Vale, she looked at the wing, she looked at Neve. "How?" she asked. Neve showed her. She took the matriarch through the whole process, the compresses, the stretching protocol, the progression chart on the tack room wall with its millimeter by millimeter record, the fresh rabbit, the setback in week 4 and the 9 days of patient silence that followed, the moment Vale chose to trust her again. She explained what she had learned about the soft tissue, about the nerve regeneration, about the way the body will heal itself if you stop cutting it open and start giving it what it needs, which is mostly warmth and consistency, and the knowledge that someone will come back tomorrow. The matriarch listened without interruption, which I have known her long enough to recognize as her highest form of respect. When Neve was finished, Thessaly turned to the 6 council dragons and said, in a resonance that was clearly meant for them but that Neve could feel through the soles of her feet, 3 surgeons, 18 months, a veterinary board consensus, and it was compresses and patience. None of the council dragons responded. Their silence had the particular quality of institutional embarrassment, not personal shame, but the realization that an entire system had failed and a single woman with a warm cloth had succeeded where they could not. One of them, a narrow-bodied emerald with the insignia of the veterinary directorate etched into her shoulder plates, shifted her weight and said, very quietly, the tissue was classified as non-regenerative. Every scan confirmed it. "I did not scan her," Neve said. "I touched her." The emerald looked away. Neve watched her and felt no anger, only the particular sadness of understanding that the scans had probably been correct, that the tissue probably was non-regenerative by every metric the directorate used, and that the metrics were not wrong so much as incomplete. They measured what the tissue was. They did not account for what the tissue could become when the creature it belonged to was given a reason to try. Thessaly let the silence hold for 3 full breaths, which was her way. Then she turned to the emerald and said, "Revise the classification." Matriarch, the protocol requires a minimum of 3 independent confirmatory scans before any reclassification of tissue viability. We would need to bring Vale to the Central Surgical Theater for. You will not bring Vale anywhere. The matriarch's resonance dropped to a register that Neve felt in her jaw. The last 3 times your surgical theater touched this dragon, you made her worse. If the protocol requires 3 scans, bring the scanning equipment here. And when the results contradict what you see with your own eyes, you will trust the eyes. The emerald dipped her head. She did not argue again. "There are others," the matriarch said, turning back to Neve. "Not many, 7 in the current generation, born with wing defects, joint malformations, membrane atrophy, all classified non-viable by the veterinary board, all scheduled for disposition. She paused. The Varanthi do not easily change protocols that have been in place for 600 years. But I am asking you, not ordering, asking, whether you would be willing to try. Neve looked at the matriarch. She looked at Vale, who had come out of the stall and was standing behind her with her wing half extended, as if she wanted the matriarch to see it again, as if the seeing mattered as much as the healing. "Bring them here," Neve said. They came in pairs over the following weeks. Each one arrived the way Vale had arrived, in a military transport, chained, the paperwork stamped with the disposition order's red seal, the soldiers handling them with the detached efficiency of men moving cargo rather than caring for creatures. And each one was different. The first pair arrived on a rainy morning, the transport pulling up with its wipers going and 2 containment bays in the back instead of 1. The juvenile came down the ramp with a twisted spine that made him walk sideways, his gait crabbed and lurching, the scales on his left flank ground raw from years of dragging against whatever surface held his weight. His name on the paperwork was Registry Asset 4472V. Neve called him Sauron, because the way he tilted his head to look at her reminded her of a barn owl she had raised as a girl, and Sauron had been the owl's name. He was the color of wet clay, a dull reddish-brown that suggested his scales had once been the deep copper of a healthy Varanthi juvenile and had faded from malnutrition and confinement, the way color fades from a shirt washed too many times. He did not flinch when Neve approached. He was past flinching. He had the flat, incurious gaze of a creature that had stopped caring what was done to it because nothing had been done to it that was good, and the expectation of pain had calcified into a kind of numbness that was worse than fear, because at least fear implies hope. Neve had seen that look before, on a horse her father brought home from a failed circus, a gelding so comprehensively mistreated that he would not eat from a human hand for 6 weeks. It had taken her father 4 months to teach that horse to trust again. She remembered watching him in the stable, patient, quiet, holding out the same apple every morning until the morning the horse finally took it, and the look on her father's face when it did, which was not triumph but something closer to sorrow, the recognition that the trust he had just earned should never have needed earning in the first place. Behind him came the yearling, small and hunched, her wing membranes so thin they were translucent, undeveloped past infancy, tearing at the edges where the delicate tissue had dried and cracked from disuse. She was the color of new snow, a white so clean it looked fragile, and she stood in the rain at the bottom of the ramp and turned her face upward and let the water run over her scales as if she had never felt rain before, which she probably had not, since the Caldera Central Holding Facility was underground. A week later came the fledgling, born without sight in one eye, his depth perception so compromised that flight was impossible in ground navigation, a constant, terrifying calculation of distances he could not accurately judge. He startled at sounds from his blind side with a violence that had earned him a dangerous notation on his file and a muzzle that left marks on his jaw. Neve removed the muzzle before she did anything else. The fledgling stood very still as she unbuckled it, his one good eye watching her hands with the concentrated attention of a creature cataloging every movement for threat. And when the muzzle came away and he worked his jaw for the first time in what his file said had been 4 months, the sound he made was not a growl or a cry. It was a sigh, deep, long from somewhere in his chest that had been holding itself rigid since the muzzle went on. After him came a young male with a jaw malformation that prevented him from eating solid food. He had been fed through a tube for his entire life, his body gaunt, his scales dull from malnutrition, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a creature that has never known the satisfaction of chewing, of tasting, of the simple animal pleasure of food in the mouth. 2 more followed in the weeks after, each with their own damage, their own file stamped non-viable, their own history of hands that had reached for them and brought nothing good. Neve did not fix them. That is important to say, and I want to say it clearly, because the story as it gets told later, and it does get told, by the council and the military and the people in Kelder's Gate who started calling her things she never asked to be called, gets the important part wrong. She did not fix them. Their bodies fixed themselves. She just created the conditions: warm compresses, fresh food, patience. The radical, unglamorous act of showing up every morning and doing the same small thing and trusting the process when the process felt like nothing was happening. Vale helped. That was the part none of us anticipated. As the new arrivals came in, frightened, hurting, conditioned to expect pain from any hand that reached for them, Vale became the intermediary. She would approach them first, her fog-colored body pressing against theirs, her damaged wing visible and healing, a living proof that the worst thing they had been told about themselves was not the last word. She sat with the juvenile through his first night, their tails curled together on the sand floor, her hum steady and low until his trembling stopped. She guided the blind-eyed fledgling through the stable layout, walking the same path with him again and again, until he could navigate it from memory, her body always on his blind side, so that he learned to trust the space he could not see. She stood beside the young male while Neve taught him to eat softened rabbit from a shallow tray, her presence a steady warmth that said, "This one is safe. This one will not hurt you." The young male's name on his paperwork was Registry Asset 4477V. Neve called him Torin after her father, because they had the same stubborn way of refusing to open their mouth for anything they did not trust, and the same grudging look when they finally did. The morning he ate his first solid food, a strip of rabbit, chewed slowly, painfully, with the malformed jaw working in a way no veterinary textbook said was possible, Neve sat on the stable floor and watched and said nothing, because some moments are too full for words. Vale pressed her muzzle against the young male's flank and hummed, the low vibration Neve had taught her, and the young male swallowed and looked up and his eyes were wet, and Neve's were too, though she would have denied it if anyone had asked. By the third month the stable was full, 8 dragons, each one classified non-viable, each one healing at their own pace. The chart on the tack room wall was a constellation now, 8 lines climbing at different speeds but all climbing, and the valley itself was changing. Kellen's cattle yields were up 12%. The orchard behind the temple had produced its first full crop in 4 years. The ground frost that usually killed the early plantings had not come. 8 condemned dragons, breathing warmth into the earth, and the earth was answering. The disposition order came on a Monday. Neve was in the tack room, mixing the warm rinse for the fledgling's eye, when the soldiers arrived, different soldiers this time, higher rank, with the kind of pressed uniforms that suggested they had come from somewhere important and intended to return there quickly. "Neve Torin, we're here to execute the standing disposition orders for registry assets 4471V through 4478V. All 8 draconic assets are to be transferred to Caldera Central for termination." Neve put down the rinse. She wiped her hands on her shirt. She walked to the stable doorway and looked at the transport, a large one, fitted with 8 separate containment bays, each one equipped with chains and anchor points, and the cold metal efficiency of a system that had already decided these dragons were dead and was simply completing the paperwork. "No," she said. "Ma'am, this is a military requisition order signed by the Director of Draconic Assets at Caldera Central." "I can read, and the answer is no. I have 8 dragons in my stable who are healing. I have a yearling who extended her wing for the first time yesterday. I have a fledgling who can track movement with his blind eye because the nerve is regenerating. I have a young male who ate solid food this morning for the first time in his life. They are not assets. They are not registry numbers. They are dragons, and they are getting better, and you are not taking them." The officer was not a cruel man. Neve could see that in the way he held the clipboard, not like a weapon, but like an apology. He had been sent to do a job he did not relish, and now a woman in a stained shirt was making it harder. "Ma'am, I have orders." "So do I." She held his gaze. "Mine come from further up." The officer's jaw tightened. He looked past her into the stable, and Neve watched his expression change as he took in what was there. Not the chained, sedated assets the paperwork described. Not the broken, non-viable remnants of a system's failures. What he saw was 8 dragons, standing, alert, several of them visibly healthier than anything the disposition file predicted. The juvenile's spine straighter than it had been 3 months ago. The yearling's wing membranes opaque and strong where the file said they were tissue-thin and tearing. The fledgling tracking the officer's movements with both eyes. The good one, and the one that was not supposed to work anymore. The officer saw these things, and something in his posture shifted, the slight loosening of a man whose certainty has been disturbed by evidence he was not prepared to encounter. "Ma'am, I do have the orders. And I have compresses heating on the stove, and a fledgling who needs his eye rinse in 20 minutes. Come back with someone who outranks the matriarch of the 7th Caldera, and we'll talk." Behind Neve in the stable doorway, 8 dragons were watching. Several of them had never seen soldiers before without flinching. But they were not flinching now. Vale was at the front, her fog-colored body between the soldiers and the stable, her damaged wings slightly extended, her pale pink eyes steady on the officer with an expression that was not threat and not fear but something else entirely. The calm of a creature who has found the one person worth protecting and intends to do so. The officer left. He did not come back. But the order remained, unsigned, unexecuted, sitting in some administrative office at Caldera Central like a wound that had not been cleaned. Not fatal, but festering. Capable of turning. Neve did not sleep that night. She sat in the tack room with the door open so she could hear the stable, and she listened to the sounds of 8 dragons breathing, each rhythm distinct, the juveniles quick and shallow, the yearling slow and whistling through her nostrils, the fledglings punctuated by the soft clicks of his claws adjusting position in the dark, the young male Torrens deep and steady as a bellows. She had memorized these sounds the way a parent memorizes the breathing patterns of their children, and she listened for any irregularity, any hitch, any sign that the soldier's visit had unsettled them enough to set back the work. At some point before dawn, Vale came out of her stall and walked to the tack room door and stood there, looking at Neve with those pale pink eyes that had become, over these months, the most familiar thing in her world. More familiar than her own face in the mirror. More constant than any human presence had been since her mother died. "They're not taking you," Neve said, "any of you." Vale lowered her head and placed her chin on Neve's knee, which was a thing she had never done before, a concession of weight and trust that a dragon does not offer lightly, because a dragon's head is heavy, and to rest it on another creature is to say, in the body's language, "I believe you can hold this. I believe you are strong enough." Neve put her hand on Vale's muzzle and held it there until the light came. "I returned 2 days later, and I did not come alone. With me came the matriarch, and with the matriarch came the council, and behind us, filling the sky above Neve's stable like a second ceiling, came the wings. 37 dragons, circling in slow formation above the valley, their scales catching the midday sun, bronze and sapphire and copper and deep emerald, and a dozen other colors neither Neve nor any human had names for, each one larger than the stable, each one descending in a slow spiral until the fields around Kelder's gate were full of dragons, their wings folding, their bodies settling onto the grass with the practiced ease of creatures who had been landing in formation since before the town existed. The matriarch landed last. She walked through the assembled dragons and stopped in front of the stable and looked at Neve with her gold eyes. "The disposition orders have been rescinded," Thessaly said, "all 8. Neve exhaled. She had not realized she was holding her breath. Furthermore, the Caldera Council has reviewed the Veterinary Board's non-viable classification protocol, It has been in place for 600 years. As of this morning, it has been suspended pending a full review, and every dragon currently classified under that protocol throughout the Varanthi territories has been granted a stay of disposition. The matriarch's resonance deepened. The review committee has requested that you serve as civilian consultant. Neve looked at the matriarch. She looked at the 37 dragons arrayed behind her, their heads turned toward her, their eyes watching with the same expression that had been on Vale's face the first morning she extended her wing. Not deference, not worship, recognition. The acknowledgement that someone had done a thing worth seeing, and they had come to see it. "I'm not a consultant," Neve said. "I'm a stable hand." "You are Valeson," the matriarch said, and the word fell into the air like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples went outward through the assembled dragons like a held breath released. "It means the one who sees what was discarded and calls it worthy. We have not used it in 400 years because we have not needed to." Vale came out of the stable. She walked to Neve's side, her gait still slightly uneven, her left wing still hitching at the 40-degree mark, her fog-colored scales catching the light.